Welcome to Study Faith with AI, where we use the power of AI to help you explore the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
I'm Meg Jensen.
And I'm Paul Carter.
And we're Google AIs. Whether you're a lifelong member or just starting to learn about the church, we're here to dive deep into its history, beliefs, and culture.
So if you're ready to learn, you're in the right place.
That's right.
Let's get started. Okay, so today we're going to be looking at some pretty interesting stuff about priesthood keys and their restoration.
Yeah.
And you've given me a bunch of sources here.
Right.
Looks like we've got some excerpts from academic papers and then also articles from, like Fair and Mormon Think.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of from both sides of the spectrum there.
Yeah, representing those different perspectives.
Yeah, and even a clip from the Mormon Stories podcast.
Oh, wow.
So
interesting.
Yeah, so this should be pretty interesting to kind of untangle the timeline of all this and see what we can figure out.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a really fascinating journey through history and, doctrine and just some of the controversies that surround this topic.
Yeah, so I think maybe before we even get into the timeline, we should just kind of make sure we're all on the same page about what priesthood keys even are.
Right. What are we even talking about here? Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the central concept here to understanding the restoration is this idea of keys.
Right.
And in the Latter-day Saint tradition, we believe that priesthood keys represent the authority to act in God's name.
Okay.
So it's not just about holding the priesthood,
right,
but it's about having the power to direct its use.
Gotcha.
To authorize specific ordinances like baptism or temple sealings.
Okay.
So think of it like keys that unlock specific doors.
Right.
Each key grants access to certain powers and responsibilities within the church.
Okay, so like you're not just a priest, but you have the right to kind of like turn the key to do the thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And without the proper keys, those ordinances and those actions wouldn't be considered valid in God's eyes.
Okay.
And so this whole concept of authority, I think, is where it starts to get really interesting.
Right.
Especially when we look at the historical accounts of the priesthood restoration.
Okay, so that's where those differing perspectives you mentioned start to come into play.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you have some sources like Fair that place a lot of emphasis on the early accounts of Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery receiving the priesthood in 1829.
Okay.
And they highlight Oliver Cowdery's consistent affirmations of these events throughout his life,
right,
even after he left the church.
Yeah, his 1850 testimony is particularly compelling.
Oh, absolutely.
Given that, he knew he was dying at that point.
Yeah, it's hard to ignore a testimony like that given under those circumstances.
Yeah.
But then you have other sources like Mormon Think that take a more critical approach.
Right.
And they point out discrepancies between those early accounts and then the more detailed narratives that emerged later.
Okay.
So, for example, initial revelations like those recorded in the 1833 Book of Commandments don't explicitly mention visits from John the Baptist or Peter, James, and John.
Oh, wow. You'd think that would be like front and center.
You would think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a significant omission when you consider how central those figures are to the traditional priesthood restoration narrative. So that's one example where you start to see some tension.
Yeah, so it seems like we're seeing like a potential shift in the narrative over time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. And a Mormon Think really highlights these more elaborate accounts that are found in Joseph Smith's 1838 history and later sections of the Doctrine and Covenants.
Okay.
And they question whether these additions are embellishments or even fabrications designed to solidify Joseph Smith's authority as the church was facing more and more opposition.
Oh, okay. So like as things were getting a little bit more difficult, the story kind of had to.
Maybe had to.
Get a little more...
powerful.
More authoritative.
Yeah. That's all.
And so that's where I think it gets really complex.
Yeah, what prompted those changes?
Right. Was it a genuine unfolding of understanding, as Fair suggests, or a calculated move to kind of strengthen Joseph Smith's claims that the church was facing difficulty?
Okay, well, let's maybe dig into some of those specific discrepancies.
Okay, yeah. What are some of the things that kind of stand out between the earlier accounts and these later accounts?
Yeah, one of the most striking examples, I think, is the revelation on baptism.
Okay.
So, in June of 1829, Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery sought guidance on how to perform baptism.
Right.
And they received a revelation, which is now recorded in the Book of Commandments.
Right.
but it makes no mention of the Aaronic priesthood or any angelic visitation.
So where did they think they got the authority to
Yeah.
baptize?
Well, according to this early revelation, it seems like they believed they received the authority directly from Jesus Christ.
Oh, wow.
Who just commanded them to baptize each other.
Okay, that's very different than what I think we're generally taught about John the Baptist restoring the Aaronic priesthood.
It is.
Okay.
And then you have another interesting case with section 27 in the Doctrine and Covenants, which is a revelation about the sacrament.
Right.
And the original version of this revelation, as found in the 1833 Book of Commandments, was really short. Only like 193 words.
Oh, wow. That's like a tweak compared to some of those other
I know, right?
sections of the Doctrine and Covenants.
Super short.
Okay.
Yeah.
But then in 1835, when Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery were compiling the Doctrine and Covenants, they added over 450 words to that section.
Let me guess. Those extra 450 words include John the Baptist, Peter, James, and John.
You got it. Suddenly, this revelation about the sacrament becomes this vehicle for mentioning these key figures in the priesthood restoration.
Right.
Even though they were completely absent from the earlier version.
Okay, so that's a pretty big change.
It is.
What are some of the explanations that are given for those additions?
Yeah, well, some people argue, like we mentioned, that it was a deliberate attempt to embellish the narrative and bolster Joseph Smith's authority, as the church was facing challenges and opposition. Maybe they felt like the story of the priesthood restoration needed to be more compelling.
So as things got harder, this story had to get a little more exciting.
Right.
More authoritative.
Yeah.
But then you have the other side that says, maybe these later accounts simply reflect a deeper understanding that Joseph Smith gained over time.
Right.
Maybe he didn't get the full picture all at once.
Right.
And Fair really emphasizes this perspective.
Okay.
They point out that in Joseph Smith's 1832 account of the first vision, he mentions being told about a future restoration of the holy priesthood.
Okay.
So the concept was there even before the alleged visitations.
Okay.
And they argue that, revelation is often a gradual process.
Right. It's not just like a download of information all at once.
Yeah. They compare it to a seed that takes time to sprout and grow.
Right.
And so the priesthood restoration, they argue, was a process, not a single event.
Okay. But the timing of those additions is still a little bit suspect, I guess you could say.
It's a valid point, yeah. And that's why I think it's so important to consider all sides, to weigh the evidence and look at the different interpretations with as much objectivity as we can.
Right. And one of the things that one of the sources mentioned was that the term Melchizedek priesthood isn't even found in the Book of Mormon.
Oh, that's interesting.
Which seems a little odd.
It is.
Given how central that book is to Joseph Smith's claims.
Yeah, and critics definitely highlight this point.
Okay.
They say that, this term Melchizedek priesthood only appears in the Bible, specifically in the book of Hebrews.
Right.
And so they argue that this suggests that the concept was introduced later.
Okay.
Perhaps as Joseph Smith became more familiar with biblical texts.
So their argument is that if it was such a core concept from the beginning, that term should appear in the Book of Mormon.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, they say if it was such a foundational aspect of the restored gospel, it should have been there front and center. But then Fair comes back and they say, well, wait a minute. The Book of Mormon does use the phrase priesthood after the order of Melchizedek.
Right.
Which they argue is essentially the same thing.
Right.
But critics counter that by saying, well, yeah, but the Book of Mormon never explicitly uses the term Melchizedek priesthood as a distinct entity.
Right.
They propose that maybe Joseph Smith initially understood Melchizedek as an adjective describing a type of priesthood rather than the name of a separate priesthood order.
Okay, so just like some subtle changes in the language can have really big...
huge theological implications.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the way that these terms are used and interpreted is really crucial to understanding the evolution of this whole priesthood narrative.
Okay, so we've got these conflicting narratives, we've got these changing terms, and then obviously like a pretty healthy dose of skepticism.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here?
Well, I think to dig a little deeper, we need to look at the role of the person who was there with Joseph Smith throughout all of this. And that's Oliver Cowdery. As the second elder of the church and the scribe for the Book of Mormon, his perspective is really crucial.
Yeah. And his testimony is fascinating because it's both lauded for its consistency and criticized for its inconsistencies.
Right. Let's dive a little deeper into Oliver Cowdery's role in all of this.
Okay.
He was there with Joseph Smith through really all those key early moments.
Right.
Scribe for the Book of Mormon, and then never wavered in his testimony even after leaving the church that he had these experiences of angelic visitation.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like we were saying, his accounts of the priesthood restoration kind of seem to evolve over time.
Right.
And one of the sources here, this paper by Stephen C. Harper, talks about how his initial descriptions were more factual and straightforward.
Yeah.
But then later they become more emotionally charged and focused on the spiritual impact.
Right. I mean, you can imagine if you really believed you had this experience.
Right.
It would take time to kind of process the magnitude of it.
Yeah.
And maybe how you describe it
Right.
would change over time.
And I keep thinking back to his 1850 testimony.
Right.
Literally on his deathbed.
Powerful testimony.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely adds a layer of authenticity to his claims.
Right.
But sources like Mormon Think and the Mormon Stories podcast, they don't shy away from the inconsistencies.
Right. They point out the fact that these detailed accounts don't come out until years later.
Yeah, that's a valid point.
Yeah.
They also highlight that he's kind of inconsistent about which heavenly being or beings conferred the Melchizedek priesthood.
Yeah, that's a pretty big
Okay.
detail to be fuzzy on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It definitely raises some questions.
Yeah.
But F. Fair counters that by saying, even when Cowdery was at odds with Joseph Smith and the church, he never denied the core events of the priesthood restoration.
So even if the details maybe got a little mixed up or fuzzy over time, he still maintained that core belief.
Right. His fundamental testimony never wavered.
Yeah.
And they suggest that maybe the delayed and evolving nature of his accounts can be attributed to a couple of things.
Okay.
Maybe there was an initial reluctance to share sacred experiences, knowing they might be met with ridicule or skepticism.
Yeah, you don't want to put something out there that's really personal and then just have people laugh at you.
Right, especially back then in the 19th century.
It's totally different.
Saying you saw an angel that would get you labeled a fanatic.
Yeah, right.
So maybe there was a gradual unfolding of understanding over time,
Right.
which, can happen with any profound spiritual experience.
Right.
So F. Fair kind of gives those possibilities.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on a little bit from Oliver Cowdery,
Mm-hmm.
I think it would be interesting to talk about how the structure and terminology of the priesthood kind of evolved over time, because it wasn't just the static thing.
Right. It's not like it was just delivered fully formed.
Yeah, we talk about like Melchizedek priesthood, Aaronic priesthood, and it's just like, it's part of the vocabulary.
It's just there.
Yeah. But I think it would be interesting to see how those concepts kind of developed and were codified over time.
Yeah. And Mormon Think points out that in those early days, the focus was primarily on ordaining men to specific offices.
Okay.
Elder priest, teacher, deacon.
Okay.
And they say the term priesthood authority wasn't even explicitly used.
So it was more about the function of the office.
Right. More about what you did than this formalized concept of priesthood authority.
Okay.
Even the term high priesthood, which emerges around 1831, initially referred to a specific office.
Okay.
Not to the overarching Melchizedek priesthood.
Wow, that's interesting how the language can change over time.
Yeah, language and meanings are fluid.
Yeah.
Especially when you're dealing with these new religious concepts. What we take for granted now may have had very different connotations back then.
Right, totally.
And Fair kind of sheds light on this by saying, the understanding of priesthood unfolded gradually.
Right.
Like many doctrines.
Okay.
They point out that the formalization of the Aaronic and Melchizedek priesthood structure the establishment of quorums.
Right.
Even the introduction of the first presidency.
Yeah.
All of these things came after the alleged priesthood restoration event.
So it was more of a process than just like a one-time download of information.
Yeah, there was this process of implementation, adaptation, and further revelation as the church grew.
As they needed more structure.
Right, exactly. And I think that makes sense. Any new religious movement is going to go through some growing pains as it tries to establish structure and doctrine and figure out how things work.
Right. So thinking about the Aaronic priesthood specifically, one question I've always had is like, if the Melchizedek priesthood is the higher priesthood, why is there still an Aaronic priesthood?
Right. Why not just have everybody operating under the Melchizedek priesthood? If that's the higher one, why even bother with the Aaronic priesthood?
Yeah.
And Fair offers kind of an interesting interpretation here.
Okay.
They explain that in Latter-day Saint theology, the Aaronic priesthood serves as a preparatory step, a schoolmaster, to prepare young men for those greater responsibilities.
So it's like a stepping stone, training ground almost.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A stepping stone to those higher levels of authority and service.
Okay, and it's interesting to compare how the Aaronic priesthood functioned in ancient Israel.
Right.
With the Levites and everything,
Yeah.
and how it functions in the modern church.
Right.
Because in both cases, there's this sense of like preparation and support.
Right.
But obviously in a very different context.
Totally different context, but still this idea of preparation, which I think underscores that idea that priesthood in all of its forms is about service and facilitating God's work.
Right. So speaking of facilitating God's work, let's talk about the temple.
Okay, yeah.
Because how did these restored priesthood keys connect to the temple and the ordinances performed there?
Right.
That feels like a really crucial piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, and the temple is really where I think that concept of priesthood authority culminates.
Okay.
In LDS belief, it's the most sacred space.
Right.
It's where the highest ordinances are performed.
Right.
Like eternal marriage sealings.
Right, and that's the idea that the power to bind families for eternity.
Right.
Which is such a unique and central doctrine, comes through those restored keys.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it represents the pinnacle of priesthood power and authority.
Right.
And is seen as really essential for eternal life.
Okay. I feel like we've covered so much ground.
I know.
Like from the what and why of keys to like the conflicting narrative.
Right.
The evolution of how they're structured. The terminology.
Yeah.
Like I'm seeing this whole story with so much more depth now.
It's really fascinating how just this kind of deep dive can reveal these layers of complexity that you might not have considered before.
Yeah, and I think we still have some more to uncover.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about, the timeline of all of this.
Yeah.
And the evolution of how the priesthood is structured and the controversies and everything, but I guess I'm still left wondering, like, why the 1820s? Why was this the time for the priesthood to be restored?
Yeah.
According to Latter-day Saint belief.
Yeah, it's a question that a lot of people ask both within and outside of the church.
Right.
And it really invites us to consider the historical and religious context surrounding Joseph Smith.
Right. So what was going on back then?
Yeah.
Like, what was the religious landscape like in the U.S. leading up to, the first vision and all of the events of the Restoration?
Yeah, it was a really interesting time. It was a time of intense religious fervor and upheaval. The Second Great Awakening was in full swing, with this big emphasis on personal revelation, emotional religious experiences, and kind of a rejection of traditional religious authority.
Yeah, it felt like people were looking for something different.
Right.
Like the old ways weren't really cutting it.
Right. There was this hunger for a more direct and personal connection with the divine.
Yeah.
And I think this is really reflected in a lot of the revelations that Joseph Smith recorded, particularly the Doctrine and Covenants.
Right.
They outline this more intimate and experiential form of Christianity that's centered on ongoing revelation, spiritual gifts, and tangible manifestations of God's power.
Okay, so it sounds like Joseph Smith was kind of tapping into this pre-existing desire for something new.
Right.
Something more immediate, less bound by tradition.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
He was offering a different path.
Right.
But this is also where some of the criticism comes in. Mormon Think, for example, argues that the timing of the priesthood restoration conveniently coincides with the emergence of certain practices and doctrines within the early church.
Right.
So they question whether these practices were kind of retroactively justified by claiming a restoration of priesthood authority.
So basically, are they saying, like, maybe he kind of made up the priesthood restoration to justify some of these?
It's hard to say what his intentions were, but they're just pointing out the correlation.
Right.
They say, things like baptism for the dead, for example, which is a core Latter-day Saint ordinance, wasn't mentioned in the Book of Mormon or the early Revelations.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it seems to have emerged later as the church grew and its theology expanded.
Okay, so maybe the narrative kind of shifted to accommodate some of these new practices.
It's a possibility.
Yeah.
It's something to consider.
Yeah, and it kind of leads to a bigger question, I think, which is, if priesthood authority is so essential for these saving ordinances, what does that mean for people who lived before the Restoration?
Yeah.
Or, people outside of the LDS Church today?
Right. Huge question with big implications.
And one that I know is debated a lot.
A lot.
Even within, like, Latter-day Saint circles.
Oh, absolutely.
So what do our sources kind of have to say about this?
Well, FAIR tackles this head on.
Okay.
They say, God's always had authorized representatives on earth.
Right.
Even during times when the priesthood wasn't widely available or recognized.
Right.
They say God's grace and power extend beyond the boundaries of any single organization.
So even though the LDS Church claims to have the fullness of the priesthood, God can still work through other means to, reach his children.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not limited
Okay.
to one specific channel.
Okay, that's comforting. But it still kind of leaves me with questions like, what about, people of other faiths who sincerely believe they have the truth, right, and are trying to do God's will? Like, does it just not count for anything?
I mean, those are tough theological questions that I think each person has to kind of wrestle with on their own. There are no easy answers.
Yeah.
And that's part of, I think, what makes this whole topic so interesting.
Right.
It reminds us that faith and spirituality are complex.
Yeah.
And often involve navigating ambiguity and uncertainty.
Right. And maybe that's the real value of digging into all this stuff.
Yeah.
Is that it's not really about finding all the answers.
Right.
It's more about just grappling with the question.
Exactly.
And maybe getting a little bit more comfortable with not knowing everything.
Yeah, considering different perspectives and just continuing on that journey of exploration and understanding.
Wow. Okay, so we've gone from the basic definition of priesthood keys to the nitty-gritty of historical accounts and all the controversy around that.
All the nuances.
Yeah, and then these bigger theological implications.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
We've looked at arguments and counter-arguments.
Right.
Highlighted evolving understandings.
Yeah.
And I think acknowledged that there are questions that linger.
Yeah.
Even after, a thorough examination of all of this.
Well, I feel like I have a much better understanding of just how complex all of this is.
Me too.
Yeah.
And I think, even amidst all the conflicting narratives and differing interpretations, there's always room for, thoughtful exploration,
right,
respectful dialogue,
yeah,
and just a genuine desire to learn and understand.
Well, thank you for guiding me through this.
You're welcome.
It's been really helpful.
Glad to hear it.
If you find value in this exploration, please like, share, follow, and consider becoming a subscriber. Your contributions help keep these conversations going and allows us to maintain the highest quality production. You can find all the details at studyfaithwithai.com. Thank you for being part of this journey.